to ask the audience, first of all, if you could raise your hand if you or one of your friends has been tripped up by a psychedelic experience or a spiritual experience, if you've maybe experienced spiritual narcissism or an unexpected kundalini awakening that's kind of blown you apart, or or guru messiahs or cultish groups that sort of slowly revealed themselves to be something other than what they were. Put your hands up if you've had those sorts of experiences. Yeah, I thought. And some people are putting two hands up. I thought that might be the case. Well, we're the corner of medicine that is going to talk about where things get complicated and where perhaps people get tripped up by their spiritual journey and how to avoid it and what to wise up to. My name is Fleur Britten. I'm a journalist. I write for the national newspapers and British magazines on all sorts of subjects, but I have over the years written a lot about spirituality and consciousness, and more recently written about how it can go wrong. I'm going to ask my panel to introduce themselves. Let's start at this end with Jules. Could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Jules Evans. I'm a writer. I am the director of something called the Challenging Psychedelic Experiences Project, which researches post-trip difficulties and what helps people to have them or to cope with them. And I'm also the editor of a newsletter called Ecstatic Integration, which looks at how we can reintegrate ecstatic experiences into Western culture safely and wisely.
Hi everyone, it's lovely being here and seeing so many faces. I'm Jennifer Tessler. I'm a founding director of Alalaho. It's psilocybin assisted retreat organization, so we basically hold space for people to go through transformational experiences, and we very much see psychedelics as just one modality to begin doing inner work. I'm also a qualified psychotherapist and a Buddhist practitioner.
And I'm Mark Vernon. I'm a writer and a psychotherapist. I worked in psychiatric hospitals as well as in private practice. I'm working at the moment with the Beckley Foundation, one of the players in this space, and we're thinking about worldview particularly. And also I do conversations with Rupert Sheldrake, who people may well have heard of too. So that's some of the relevance perhaps for now.
Hi everyone, thanks for being here. My name is Alexander Beiner. I'm a writer and journalist. I'm the author of a book called The Bigger Picture, How Psychedelics Can Help Us Make Sense of the World. So I'm particularly interested in psychedelic capitalism and more broadly the shadow side of our spirituality more generally as well. So.
Hi everybody, I'm Stefana Bosse. I am touched that you all care so much when there's so much fun things going on to be here. I am the other founding director of Alalaho, and before that I was the co-founder of the UK Psychedelic Society's Experience Retreats, which were basically the first program of that kind, starting the now boom in Holland with all the psilocybin-assisted retreat programs. So been there for a while. And other than that, I'm also trained in psychotherapy, really interested in group dynamics, and have been working with ayahuasca and South American shamanism for the last 7 years.
Hello, I'm David Luke, and I'm not entirely sure what I'm doing on this panel, but I guess if you hang around on this scene long enough, you get asked to do all kinds of things. But I'm associate professor of psychology, and I've been researching psychedelics and altered states for too long, probably. So that's me.
Thank you, panel. So let's start with psychedelics, which really is at peak hype right now in plant medicines. And it seems like not a week goes past when there's not a glowing review of someone who's gone on a psychedelic retreat to address an issue, and they've had an overnight transformation, which is possibly a dangerous narrative for us all to be consuming. What is the reality? I wanted to ask, perhaps let's start with you, Jules, and your challenging psychedelic experiences project. What sort of things have come up in your research? What patterns have you noticed?
Yeah, so we just felt that most of the research and most of the funding was focused on all the positives and upsides of psychedelics, which are definitely real, and I'm sure many of you have experienced them. And like, where was the research on the difficulties, on the downsides, on the risks. So we and some other teams have started doing research on that in the last few years. And for example, in one study, about 9% of people who took psychedelics said they'd had a bad trip that led to difficulties lasting longer than a day afterwards. Dave and I work on this project. We did a survey asking people, have you ever had difficulties lasting longer than a day after a trip? We got like over 600 responses. A third of our responses said their difficulties lasted longer than a year. A sixth said their difficulties lasted longer than 3 years. They were reporting things like feeling disconnected from the people around them, feeling derealized, feeling the sense of existential confusion. And what helps people in that situation? Well, at the moment, there's hardly any research on what helps people who get into post-trip difficulties. So there's a huge amount of kind of hype encouraging people to take psychedelics. And then if they get into problems, you're kind of out on your own. You're in the Wild West. You might go to a psychiatrist who says you've got chronic psychosis. You might go to a healer who says, well, you are a Nazi in a previous life. That's what happened to a cousin of mine after he had a kind of bad trip. So, you know, there's a lack of research in this area. So we and others are trying to bring in better research to support the minority of people who sometimes have these difficulties.
Is there a case to say that those difficulties are important and part of the healing? Like, perhaps, you know, please respond, but perhaps other people on the panel will respond to that too.
We asked people, and some people felt yes, it was part of a healing process, and some people felt no. There's another project, the Canadian Psychedelic Survey. 55% of people who had a bad trip in that felt it was ultimately healing, but that means 45% of people felt it wasn't.
Anybody else on the panel like to talk about?
I think, yeah, and a similar thing they did in a survey at Johns Hopkins, they had something like 85% said it ultimately was positive, but getting there wasn't necessarily easy, and 15%, of course, it never really was ultimately positive. So, you know, some people do have long-term, lasting negative consequences from their experiences.
And perhaps, so Jennifer and Stefana and Ali, you all run retreats, psychedelic retreats. Are you aware of any patterns that emerge? You know, are you able to see the people who you think might struggle, or are there, you know, are there signs that you can help people with? Is it completely random who suffers and who doesn't suffer?
I mean, I think one crucial difference is that I presume the survey was just broad spectrum population, whereas we only take people after a very extensive screening process, so that already screens out a lot of the people that probably, and the other thing is the set and setting of the whole retreat. So actually, generally, the majority of the people don't leave the retreat. Actually, basically, no one leaves the retreat having had a horrible experience, even if their psychedelic trip might have been very challenging, because there's so much more that happens in the aftercare, even on the retreat. And then in the group process, I really believe that there's such deep healing that happens in being witnessed and held in the group, that also when you're alone having a trip, it's hard to make sense of it. And then also the aftercare, the integration journey that we have, so we stay in contact with people for a long time. So that's kind of the other side of like how to prevent that happening.
Yeah, very similarly, I work with Natasha Pelgrim, running retreats, who's in the audience somewhere. And to add to that, you know, we use a similar process. Screening is very important, as is preparation. There's a lot of talk of integration in the psychedelic world, which is, you know, as important. You know, how do people make sense of the experience afterwards and integrate it into their lives? But preparation and what Frederica Meckel, who's a psychedelic researcher, calls state competence. So if you think, I often think of skydiving a bit like, I think of psychedelics like skydiving, in the sense that it's psycho-spiritual skydiving. It is dangerous, or can be at least. So you need to be prepared, and you need to have an awareness of how to navigate the experience. And so we put a lot of focus into preparing people, and screening is part of that preparation. I would say that generally people who are sort of counter-indicated in clinical trials, but also would be screened out for a retreat as anyone with a history of bipolar or psychosis. And particularly what I've noticed is people with bipolar, they can very easily go manic after a psychedelic experience. And I think that's something that is very important for everyone to be aware of, right? So it's that's one thing I've noticed.
Where have you seen that?
I've seen it in the general. I've seen it with friends. I've seen it in the general population. I think that sort of messiah complex that people can get as well is you could argue is a manic state that they're in.
When they've taken the plant medicine.
Yeah. Or afterwards as well.
Yeah.
You know, Carl Jung talked about that people, in Jungian terms, people, experience an archetype, like they might encounter a sense of Jesusness, and they confuse themselves with the archetype. So it's like, I'm Jesus, instead of I had an experience of this energy. So it's very complex.
Yeah. And I suppose that also... Sorry, please go.
There just was partly to add to what people have been saying, but Ali there particularly about the preparation. The work with the Beckley Foundation has arisen from an intuition, really, rather than actual research, but that preparation, not just in psychological terms, but philosophical terms, you might say, makes a difference. So your worldview. And if you have an integrated worldview, the intuition is that you're much more likely to be able to make sense of a psychedelic experience in an integrated way. And the risk is that people take a psychedelic hoping it's going to give them a whole worldview. And that is much more likely to lead to a bit of a mess.
Could you just expand on that integrated worldview? What does that look like?
So that would be maybe religiously inspired, maybe more philosophically inspired, but the sense of some account of reality that can join good and bad. Say, putting it very, very starkly, and that pre-exists the experience. It's already, as it were, part of your approach to life, and so it becomes a resource that then you can tap into, rather than a sort of panic response where suddenly you're left trying to integrate things that you'd never really fully encountered before, but not just psychologically. I think this is one of the... I'm wondering whether this is one of the moments now, actually, that, this conversation often goes in terms of psychology, mental health, integration, trauma, all that kind of language. And I feel that worldview, in a more metaphysical, ontological, to use the philosophical terms, is going to matter going forward as well.
Thank you. Yeah.
If I can jump in, because this feels really important, and actually I think it's brilliant that we're having this conversation, because it feels to me that part of the preparation and limiting the kind of risks of taking psychedelics is actually to go back to your initial point, sort of change that narrative that psychedelics are about changing overnight, or even that spirituality is about feeling good, actually. And there's something, and I think we do a lot of it on our retreats, and still not enough, but there's something about preparing people for the fact that it's not going to be an easy journey. It's not always fun to actually transform and shed an old skin and heal kind of wounds. So it's really important for people to just know they're getting into something really deep, and it is going to be hard. Even if there's moments where it feels joyful or there's a high, there's also going to be some dark times, and it's just absolutely part of the journey.
Mark, I wanted to ask you, with your therapy clients, what do you? Many of them have taken plant medicine, I understand. What do you observe more generally in terms of their results? Does it trip them up?
It can do. It's enormously varied, and I think another sense you get in psychology generally, but there's always more variables at play than really you can control, and enthusiasm for a new intervention in the psychology world. It's already known that this has a massive impact in terms of the outcomes, particularly in early trials. I'm old enough now to have seen the wave where CBT was going to solve the mental health crisis, and then mindfulness was going to solve the mental health. And each wave, the early trials are very promising, and the thought is that it's enthusiasm itself that becomes a big player in the early situation. And of course, a lot of attention's paid to early trials. There's also all the screening that goes on, so you're going to get good outcomes. It's a bit of a dirty secret in psychology trials that if you do a psychology trial, about 10% of your people are going to get better anyway. You don't really know why, but you have to sort of discount these things a bit, I feel.
Thank you. You guys obviously have very rigorous approaches to the clients that you accept, but obviously that's not the reality for many people, possibly most people. Perhaps David, you could talk to that. What have you heard? What are the pitfalls that catch people out in terms of choosing a bad retreat?
there is lots of issues necessarily with retreats. Not all of them have the same amount of preparation or integration or holding. You know, they all come in all different shapes and sizes. I mean, I haven't researched retreats exhaustively, but, you know, you've got every end of the spectrum, from people who may be tasering you or waterboarding you whilst you're on, you know, 5-MeO DMT.
Seriously?
Yeah, there are some bad actors out there who think it's really useful for people's healing to taser them. You know, whilst they're in the throes of a massive bufo hole. I mean, it might work, but, you know, it'd probably work if you don't do that as well.
Why would anyone go back to that? Why would that spread by word of mouth?
It's really popular.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Has anyone been on one of those and been tasered or waterboarded? Well done, well done.
It does happen.
Wow.
But, I mean, caveat emptor, you know, it's an unregulated market, you know, buyer beware, and all right, we have TripAdvisor, but that's not necessarily what it's intended for. But the only thing you can go on is review, really. But even then, like, bad actors, they get rooted out, and yet they still stay in business, and they continue operating, and people get harmed in their so-called care or lack of care. So, I don't necessarily know there is actually a solution, because they will attract people to go no matter what, and they develop a cult-like status as well. I'm not mentioning any names, but there's particularly 5-MeO DMT seems to attract these kind of, like, pretty far-out extreme operators, I have to say.
I mean, we're going to come to cult status soon as well, or cults. But, I mean, I suppose it's also a really impossible thing to regulate, partly because, you know, much of it is not necessarily legal, and much of it is not necessarily quantifiable, or, you know... was it you that was telling me about some platform or program that was trying to... I can't remember the name of it. You're not looking...
Keep going, though. I'll make something up.
No. But does anyone know of any attempts to bring some kind of standardization into...
So there have been a few attempts. There was an organization called the North Star Project, which is still going in the States, which I was involved in some of the early calls around that. And there was, a very noble but very, very difficult thing to do, trying to get the whole space to agree on a kind of code of ethics. But of course, the issue they had is that how do you enforce that code of ethics? So if you have a body that has a protected title like clinical psychologist or psychiatrist, you could lose your license for breaching the code. And so there's a real consequence. And their difficulty was, well, how do you go to a retreat center in Peru and be like, well, you've broken the code. Shame on you. And they're like, yeah, cheers. I'm just going to keep doing it. It's very tricky because even... so we have unregulated approaches, which might include tasering and really, that's like a very untrauma-informed approach, right? I'm trained in a trauma-informed approach, but at the same time, there's now a cult of trauma. And I have a friend who was in a group, and their whole methodology was you must tap into your childhood trauma. You've definitely got it, and you're going to find it. And even if you don't have it, you're in denial. So that we've seen in the 80s and 90s, very famously, psychotherapy got into lots of tangles because of what was called the memory wars, which was this idea that there are repressed memories, and you tap into these memories, and everyone must have a repressed memory of childhood abuse. And you had psychotherapists, getting really swept away, being like, what often comes up fascinating is that satanic cult abuse, just like QAnon. There were psychologists in the 90s talking about that as well. So even in psychology, there are cults. And in a way, trauma has now become the way to explain everything of the human experience, but psychotherapy does kind of play the role of religion in a non-religious Western culture. So it's a real tangle, because how do you, even when you have regulated thing, psychotherapy, like Mark was saying, it gets swept into its own reality tunnels to the detriment of patients as well.
I think that's basically where we're at, in a reality tunnel, isn't it? But also, please.
On the retreats thing, from writing about it, I get the sense that there's as many bad retreats out there as good retreat companies. And a lot of retreat companies are run by entrepreneurs looking to make as much money as possible, and the therapy aspect is very much secondary. And I hear a lot of kind of horror stories from the therapists who work at these places about how badly they're treated as well. And some of the biggest, best-known retreat companies, I hear really bad stories about them. There's a big retreat center in Costa Rica, like the biggest ayahuasca center. They have like 60 people in retreats at the same time and a handful of facilitators catering to them. And you hear stories about people that have died there, but they never really get into the press. And there's a big focus on just always getting 5-star reviews on like Google and stuff for this place. There's another famous retreat center in Jamaica where they give people high doses of psilocybin and then booze between ceremonies and let them just run around. It's on a cliff, the retreat center. So that's obviously not ideal either. So even the kind of leading players seem quite sketchy. So I would definitely do your research before booking a retreat.
I mean, that is basically spiritual capitalism, which was one of the pitfalls mentioned on the title of the talk. But I wonder, obviously, for a company to be economically viable, it has to. They can't spend that much time in the aftercare and the integration. So, is there a happy balance that you guys have found? Are your profit margins really, really tight because you do commit to the aftercare in a more robust way?
Yeah, it's a conundrum that we've wrestled with for many years, which is that our retreats are pretty expensive. Like the majority of the population cannot afford them, and still neither we as founders nor facilitators earn that much money. Like it's tight for us to even make a decent living, and yet the retreats are really expensive because to give that level of care takes a lot of human labor, a lot of time. So I don't have the solution for that. And to speak to the other point, I mean, people are so desperate. Like, it's just crazy, like, how desperate we are. And I'm not fully answering your point, but just going into the other conversations. What I wanted to come back to the point about the integrated worldview, and when Mark was talking about mental health, I think a conversation that we need to start having is about spiritual health, actually. Like, we're all talking about the mental health crisis, but it's the spiritual health crisis. And I think there's something there that has to do with our values, that has to do with our deeper alignment, that I don't know what the path is, but I think there's some, because we need to find some way that we can have access to these medicines and to other pathways, because actually also I don't think psychedelics are necessarily for everyone. I mean, I love psychedelics, I'm an advocate, but actually the more I do it, the more I realize also there are so many other paths, and the subtle work is as valuable and sometimes more valuable than the really like bam, bam, bam blasting peak work. And so many people come to our retreats actually and are so touched by all the other stuff that happens. And sometimes people don't have a psychedelic experience and they really want their peak experience. And then that's something you have to prepare people for as well. They pay like 3,000 euros to come on a retreat, and then it's not that big thing that they were hoping for. But actually, what we are starved for is connection. What we're starved for is authenticity, and psychedelics can massively help us, but that's not the only way to do it. And I think we need to be having a much, much larger conversation about what are actually the ingredients to heal, and psychedelics can be part of that, but there's so much focus, and now doing the big pharma companies wanting to roll it out in this like very medicalized, as if it's a substance, but it's really about what is the way of life, what is the culture, what are our values, what is our spiritual alignment. So somehow maybe with all of that there'll be some form that can be more accessible, affordable.
Well, did you want to say something?
Just briefly, yeah, it's similar for us with the retreats in the sense that you can't look at it as a quantitative thing. It's a qualitative experience, and that also means in the time you're giving people, for example, for aftercare, like you would certainly make more money working like a regular job in a sense. But I know I've also heard this in the Peter Gasser is a psychiatrist in Switzerland, and he does legal, he has patients coming in and their insurance actually pays for their psychedelic treatment, but it doesn't pay enough for what is actually needed. And so he and his team just end up working extra hours that's unpaid because it's needed. And so you can't, to Stefana's point just there, like a pharma company is looking at, okay, well, how can we reduce, it's very expensive to do it properly. Multiple therapists working with the same person, a lot of care, a lot of process. And so they're trying to figure out how do we cut corners, and the thing is you can't cut corners. It's not that kind of thing. It's a much deeper process. Yeah.
Sorry.
I always think it's worth remembering that drugs, any kind of drug actually, they're very low resolution. If you're on chemotherapy, you hope that it does more good than bad. Certainly in a psychiatric hospital, the conversations that go on about trying people with different medications, it's not, they've got this, therefore they take that. It's let's try this and see what happens. And then building up a whole care package around an individual is absolutely fundamental. So, the idea that psychedelics were going to wipe out 3 years of psychotherapy, which is the kind of thing which you hear, it's very deluded, I think. You've got to remember what drugs can do, but more importantly, what they can't.
Yeah.
If I can add something that's maybe sort of speaking to Stefana's point a little bit, I think there's also something where, as a culture, we're actually a little bit lost as to what spirituality is for the most part. And sometimes we sort of think that, okay, doing therapeutic work is spiritual practice, so that spiritual practice is therapeutic healing. But actually, I think there is a difference. It's like in both cases, there is something of working with ourselves, working with our ego, but I believe it's sort of different kind of surgical operations on the ego that happens when we do therapeutic work and where we do spiritual practice. And so there's something where we kind of jump into these peak experiences and try and do everything at once. But it might be useful sometimes to discern, okay, what kind of practice am I doing? What's the intention? What am I trying to do here? And not think that just one peak experience is going to kind of solve it all and take us all the way at the top of evolution.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of brings us to spiritual bypassing, doesn't it? And the temptation to just sidestep the unresolved with the magic pill, the silver bullet. But it's completely understandable when you think about this narrative of overnight transformation. What should the narrative be? How can we change that narrative? David, do you want to talk about that?
Sorry, say that again. I was miles away.
Sorry, I'm sorry. I was just saying.
I was having a spiritual experience.
I was just saying that we're really sort of talking around spiritual bypassing and how tempting that is, because the narrative, certainly from the media, is of, and anecdotally, is of overnight transformation, but and I kind of taking psychedelics just feels like an invitation to spiritually bypass. But how do we change the narrative, and what should that narrative be?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. I mean, psychedelics are like spiritual bypassing on steroids, potentially, right? And I think it's a pitfall with any spiritual path, and it doesn't just apply to psychedelics. Any kind of exceptional human experience has the potential for transforming an individual, be it induced by psychedelics or meditation or trauma. Can even lead to these kinds of spiritual awakenings. Whatever gets you there, but one of the general pitfalls in any path is like falling into spiritual bypassing, guru worship, megalomania, mythomania, whatever it is, thinking you're going mad, people not understanding yourself. There's a whole raft of potential pitfalls you have on this journey when you suddenly have a potentially life-changing experience. I don't necessarily know what the narrative is, other than maybe relax, we're all God. I saw that on a t-shirt once. That seems to be good advice. Just maybe don't take yourself too seriously. A lot of the spiritual communities I work with, indigenous shamanic cultures in Mexico, they mix the sacred and the profane deftly, constantly, and they never take themselves too seriously. They have people basically clown police force, right, that ensures that people don't get too pious and too carried away. They'll just come and rip the piss out of you if you do, or if people are actually being too stupid and silly when they should be being a bit more serious and reverent, they come and hit you with a stick. So, there's a sense in which you've got to keep these things in balance and mix the sacred and profane, and that there's a tendency and danger of people just taking themselves too seriously often, and I don't think we should ever lose sight of the cosmic joke, really. That's all I can say.
You can go back to sleep now. Just to add to that, because I feel like it's not a one answer to, okay, how can we avoid spiritual bypassing? There are these different ingredients, and so the sacred and the profane and not taking ourselves too seriously. I think another key ingredient is learning that it's okay to feel whatever is there. And I think that is one of the key things, like at our retreats, I'd say the main medicine actually, or at least on a par with psychedelics, is the experience people have when they can show the most uncomfortable things about themselves and actually realize that that's what creates connection and not more and it's the hiding, it's the pretending that creates the distance. And when we realize like, oh, I can like expose this really ugly thing about myself, and actually we all have these really ugly things about ourselves, and we're all fucked up and we're all beautiful, and to be in that, it's like, oh, thank God. And when we have that experience, then we can, that's part of the antidote to spiritual bypassing, because what spiritual bypassing is, maybe that's also worth explaining, is when we basically avoid, we have a sort of idea of what, you know, what spiritual is and what a good human is, and we avoid feeling certain things that are part of our human experience, that are messy and ugly and we think are going to make us unlovable, or that for whatever reason we don't want to feel, and we might deem them not spiritual, but actually it's all spiritual and it's all a part of it. So yeah, learning how to feel and find the beauty in what is.
Yeah, and just to...
Yeah! My ego loves that. Thank you, more. That's not spiritual bypassing.
To add to Stefana's point, I mean, Stefana and I have the same training, so we're sort of brainwashed in the same modality. but I obviously completely agree with her in that. And so also, you know, Robert Masters, there's an argument about who came up with the term spiritual bypassing, which in itself I think is great. But Robert M. Masters wrote a book, Spiritual Bypassing, and he talks about, you know, very simply, it's pain, avoidance of pain, using spiritual ideas. And that is, you know, to Stefana's point, so psychedelics by themselves aren't actually the practice. It's psychedelics in combination with another practice that is actually the modality. So psychedelics in combination with ritual or therapy or different types of practice, and relationality and relational practices where you get reflection from other people are very, very important to build in, because I've noticed the most spiritual bypassing that I've seen is in the meditation worlds and in very insular practices, because you can really zoom in and just kind of like I'm avoiding it. But it's very difficult to not get some kind of reflection from the world when you're doing deep relational work, like Stefana said, where you can really expose yourself, really feel into like, yes, like just the human stuff of like, yeah, this is shit and I hate this and I feel like shit. It's like, yeah, great, be with that. So yeah.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything to say on spiritual bypassing? Or just aware that I can't see you when I'm looking this way, and I don't know if anyone's needing to say something. But don't feel you need to say something for the sake of something. Okay. I've got another question lined up. No, please take it back. Take it back. Come on.
Well,
Come on, Jules,
I was thinking, like historically, like this New Age culture is kind of post-Christian, and it's quite romantic and like came out of Romanticism. And Romanticism, it took Christianity. Christianity was like you got religious experiences, religious community, religious rituals, and religious dogma. And Romanticism kind of stripped away a lot of that and just had religious experience. So it took away the rituals and the dogma and some of the community as well. And New Age spirituality has done that as well. So it's really kind of put spiritual experience right at the center and kind of deified it and made it an end in itself, rather than necessarily bringing you closer to God and to a good life. It's like the big wow experience. And so one way of avoiding spiritual bypass is like having a spiritual life that's not just about big wow experiences, like not the fireworks, but, you know, building a fire that's going to keep you warm and the people around you for your life.
That makes a lot of sense.
Just one thing to add that's kind of coming to mind, sort of on Ali's point. I find it really interesting when you said, Ali, about the bypassing in the meditation world, and I can certainly see that. And I think actually part of that is coming from it's not so much that it's an issue with meditation per se, but the fact that we are now learning kind of mindfulness and meditation with apps or books and just learning on our own. But traditionally, meditation was taught by a teacher. There was a transmission. And so actually learning to meditate and engaging with that path was a relational practice as well. And the role of the teacher is very much to actually be that mirror, that kind of relational mirror that shows you when you're avoiding bypassing or just going astray on the path. And I guess, yeah, just kind of dropping that point that's also another conversation around teachers and gurus, and there's a lot of complexity there. And of course, the fact that if the teacher that's transmitting whatever practice is bypassing or is a narcissist or whatever, it's quite likely that the practice that he gives will be contaminated, and it's very hard for people, disciples, students, practitioners, to then progress. So yeah, there's a whole thing here around examining a teacher, but I think because we have such an individualistic kind of culture, we're also sometimes miss out on actually just following someone, like being a disciple, surrendering. But yeah, there's a lot of danger with that in the current kind of new age scene.
Yeah, and so little inadequate information to know those dangers. Yeah. David, I wanted to ask you. Hello, David. Hello. Sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to ask. I wanted to ask about the model of exceptional human experiences. Am I right in thinking that anticipates spiritual bypassing and spiritual narcissism? Could you just tell us all about that?
Yeah, I touched on that a little bit. There's a model put forward in the early noughties by two researchers, Bria White and Susan Brown, and it looked at the experience itself, a spiritual, potentially transformative experience of any stripe, be it psychedelic-induced or otherwise, and it plots out different stages of challenge that usually come. It's not the experience itself, it's what comes afterwards and how people deal with that and the journey you go on in trying to navigate your way to a kind of more integrated, developed individual, spiritually speaking. And that they do have challenges. I already mentioned a lot of them, such as guru worship or spiritual bypassing. Thinking you're going mad is a classic one as well, when people first have these things, and that deals with a lot of what we call about ontological shock, and I think that's something you talked about there, how that a lot of the challenges people are having, particularly with psychedelic experiences, are ones of worldview, that they don't know how to deal with the experience. Maybe not the people around them don't understand it, they don't understand it themselves, they have a lot of cognitive dissonance, it conflicts with their previous worldview, and that can lead to a lot of turbulence, and in many senses people could think they're going mad. And classically, the mystical experience was either termed as something pathological or demonized, right? So it's no accident that people feel alone in these experiences and they don't necessarily know how to integrate them. Luckily, we have this kind of wider community of people who it's okay to have a spiritual experience, and you're not going to be kind of pathologized for it. But for a lot of people, they feel very isolated, and that's this is one of the many challenges that are kind of pinpointed in this overall model and map of having an exceptional human experience.
Yeah. So thinking that you're going mad is, for some people, part of the journey, but misunderstood. Is it part of the healing?
Yeah, and it's hard to define because, having what we call a spiritual emergency, perhaps, may look indistinguishable from actual psychosis, and how are we to actually really discern the difference? But, for sure, if a genuine spiritual emergency is labelled as psychosis, that's likely to hinder your resolution of that particular problem, right? But it's about finding out how do we discern the difference between genuine psychosis and what we might call a spiritual emergency?
Well, how do we? Can the people who run retreats answer that? Have you ever come across that? Where someone thinks they're going mad and...
I mean, actually, in all honesty, that's not an issue we've had on retreats. So I'm not sure I would be able to say, and I'm not a psychiatrist, so I'd rather not just try and make up an answer on the spot.
Jules, did you want to talk to that?
Yeah, I mean, in our survey, quite a few people have the fear that they're going mad, the fear that they're becoming schizophrenic or psychotic. I think it's hard. There's not a clear line between spiritual emergency and psychosis, because people who are having psychotic episodes, it feels very spiritual as well. So it is not clear. But I think you could talk about the degree of insight you have. I mean, if you're completely lost in your projections and you're completely lost in paranoia and the Illuminati are after you or something, and there's no sense that this might be an inner process, then that's more like, dangerous psychosis. If you have some sense that this might be an inner process, a psychological process, then you know it might be more like a spiritual emergency. But again, it's not hard and fast.
And the truth is, I don't think you can tell the difference. And also that, you know, psychosis, it sounds very florid in one moment and almost exciting, but actually it's also very dreary, and because it repeats and it gets stuck and it goes on. And you know, I think this is often in a psychiatric setting why medication is resorted to try and calm things down, because it takes immense patience actually to try and discern really what's going on even in a psychotic episode. So, you know, I don't think you can tell the difference, and it's really hard work.
I mean, isn't psychosis something that sort of starts with an acute episode and then stays with you for the rest of your life? Is that one way of...
It might do. I mean, people in the psychiatric world anyway talk about psychotic pockets that might continue to haunt people for a while, because, you know, once you know what it's like to, well, as Jules says, really get lost in the outer world rather than being able to stay in some kind of touch with your own inner world, you know, that fear might haunt you. But, you know, again, it's one word like trauma that's used to cover all sorts of things, in fact. Yeah.
Stefana, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I wanted to add not so much about psychosis and spiritual emergency, but just to draw the line back that this is a relevant discussion for any psychedelic experience, because even when it's not on the verge of spiritual emergency or psychotic, there's a fine question about how much do we believe what we experience. And it's like these experiences amplify, and they can bring as much clarity as they can bring confusion. And I think that's a point where we all still can get very lost, myself included, and it's not talked about that much. So I just wanted to drop that in.
Yeah, and similarly, I wanted to, you know, if we take away psychosis is like the one extreme, but then there's also just what I call bad sense making with the psychedelic experience, which is generally what I try and do myself, what I encourage people to do, and participants and anyone else who's interested in psychedelics, is to adopt a deep curiosity and a radical agnosticism to anything, because, you know, DMT entities seem incredibly real and full of agency and, you know, deeply real, but you don't know. You don't know what they are. And you have, as soon as you go away from I don't know, and I'm holding this field of possibility and sitting with the discomfort of uncertainty, you almost inevitably go down rabbit holes. And that's a skill that's not just for psychedelics, that's a skill for being in the world. And, you know, I think, you know, to Jules's point, one of the things that gets lost with a kind of new age form of spirituality is also discipline. And discipline is hard and boring. And part of the discipline of doing psychedelics well is to have a disciplined mind of don't jump to meaning too quickly, don't make any big decisions in your life for 3 months or longer, and just really sit with, what was that experience? I don't really know. I have to sit with the uncertainty, and that's uncomfortable. And I think the discomfort of that goes back to spiritual bypassing, where it's like, it's much easier if it's all about the Illuminati. Because then this dissonance I have between my experience and the world not recognizing it can all be explained because there's an external force that's changing everything. And that's, of course, it might be true, but it's probably not. Yeah.
Thank you. Let's go to spiritual narcissism, which is sort of feels like it's almost unavoidable. You know, this sort of idea of treating spirituality and the quest of it as a competition, and sort of making people feel inferior on the wayside. Stefana, I wanted to ask you. Jennifer. I'm sorry. How is that something that you can kind of implicitly help your clients with, sort of, you know, as they have a spiritual experience and it elevates the ego? Is that where do you go with that? Do you try and give them some advice around that?
Interesting question. I mean, not sure where to go with it. I guess there's something that comes to mind in response, perhaps within the context of the retreats, is that, and I was sort of hinting at earlier, it's really important for facilitators, therapists, teachers to always be in an ongoing kind of reflective process of doing their own work, and checking themselves for spiritual narcissism. I went to a Buddhist retreat once, and the teacher was going to give some teachings that are considered quite precious, and he said straight away, look, we already all have this huge ego. It's like this big, heavy bag that we have on our back all the time. And if you're going to come here to this Buddhist retreat and receive these teachings and leave with an even bigger ego because you've received precious teaching, it's better not to do the practice. So there's something of just always kind of checking, like, okay, we're having these exceptional human experiences, peak experiences, festivals, retreats, psychedelics, whatever it is. And if, as a result, there's that sense of inflation or superiority, I would say perhaps the kind of underlying thing is like if it creates more rigidity and more kind of grasping in the mind, that's a red flag and something to then engage with. And just even the fact of seeing it is already, you know, it just begins popping that bubble. But it's a constant process. It doesn't stop. Like you don't, it's like, oh, that's it, I've popped my spiritual narcissist bubble and now I'm enlightened kind of thing. It's like every step of the way we need to stay in that process. And actually the more settle the practice is, or the more kind of advanced the stage of development that one gets to, the more subtle and difficult to find and kind of track these sort of pathologies are. So yeah, ongoing work.
Thank you. Jules, you've written about this, the idea of the overlap of eugenics and New Age and social Darwinism. Can you expand on that and say how that's how that's a pitfall for us all?
I got it. I went down this rabbit hole during the pandemic. I was writing about Aldous Huxley, and I was fascinated that he was very into eugenics his whole life, and it kind of comes up in Ireland and in his lectures, and I was wondering why. And what seems to have happened is one strand of New Age culture is very into this idea of evolutionary spirituality, which is this kind of religion of evolution, this idea that evolution has a spiritual goal, that we are evolving into superhumans. And that's been a strand in New Age culture going back to like the 1880s and people like Madame Blavatsky and Nietzsche, all the way through the 60s up to kind of Californian transhumanism today, which is fine. That's no problem with that. But what sometimes happens with that is the idea that some people are evolving into superhumans. People like us, me and my friends, we are the superhuman elite. And other humans are not evolving, they're degenerating. And we need to breed more and they need to breed less, which is why you often have New Age people through history being into eugenics. I think that kind of spiritual elitism is particularly obvious in California, maybe, and maybe it's less so in the British New Age scene, he says, flattering his audience.
Is there a way of sort of the community helping the spiritual narcissists? Is there a way of kind of calling bullshit? David, you must have come across a lot of spiritual narcissists. How do you deal with that?
You're talking about me. I mean, every time I look in the mirror, it's like, yeah.
Doing the work.
I mean, how do we deal with it? I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, obviously, you need to call people out on it, but yeah, maybe there's a kind of spiritual narcissism checklist we can, you can give to people. How are you doing today on your spiritual narcissism? I don't really have an answer. I don't know.
I wonder whether this in psychodynamic psychotherapy, narcissism, I always find this helpful to remember, narcissism is not that you love yourself, it's that you fail to love yourself. And so people then develop strategies of trying to organize the world to deliver them the love that they feel that they lack. And the most sort of public, probably the phallic narcissists, as they put it in psychodynamic theory, who use power essentially to try and draw love towards themselves, and one thinks of people in public life. But perhaps in the psychedelic space, it might be more the social narcissist, and they identify with what's good, with what's healing, and with what's going to bring beauty into the world. And it's to become identified with that good and healing and beauty because they feel the lack in themselves. Another area where it's sometimes talked about is in the charity sector. And it's why sometimes you read these extraordinary stories of charities doing great work, but it turns out that these terrible shadowy things were going on as well, like abusing the people that were in the care of the charity. And so just remembering that narcissism is not loving yourself, it's the desperate attempt to try to get the love that you feel you lack. Can be quite helpful.
Jules, I was going to ask you, Instagram, do you think people are becoming more spiritually narcissistic because of Instagram? Do you think that was... Sorry. No.
I was just making a joke.
Oh, see.
I mean,
How has it made it worse?
social media and spirituality have intersected in like loads of fascinating ways, and it's really complicated. And on the one hand, yeah, it can it can kind of really give an edge to spiritual influencers who are really good looking, but which sucks. But so there's that, and it can lead to a kind of spiritual vanity and people striking gorgeous yoga poses as the sun sets, and that's obviously bad. But there's another side to it, which it's massively democratized spirituality, so anyone can be a spiritual influencer. It used to be just male gurus, and now there's less these kind of Olympian gurus, and more like everyone's a guru for 5 minutes now. So that's, I think, the good side of that kind of social media spirituality.
Jennifer, what can Buddhism teach us about spiritual narcissism and keeping the ego in check? How can we apply the teachings of Buddhism to ourselves to keep it in check?
Sure. I guess there's something, I think, first of all, it's a bit hard to answer that question in a general way, because there's so many different schools of Buddhism, and there's quite a lot of diversity. There's something about meditation that I think is incredibly useful, in that it's about training the capacity of the mind to be present and perceptive, but in an unbiased way. And that's quite fundamental to being able to pop the kind of narcissistic bubble or any kind of grasping bubble, actually. So I would say that cultivate, no matter what other practices we do, whether it's therapy, psychedelics, yoga, or tasering, or these kind of things, I suppose training the mind to kind of look at things in an unbiased way. And I guess the other thing with Buddhism, and that's where maybe it's important sometimes to kind of discern therapeutic healing work from spiritual practices. In Buddhism, it is about cutting through the ego. It's not Buddhism or meditation isn't about healing our trauma, isn't about doing therapeutic work. So there's a lot to gain, but it's kind of different level, different methods.
Thank you. Thank you.
Something that I've been become very interested in this question is also again, it goes back to having a really solid, clear framework around these practices, because, in Christianity and other religions, you have something called the problem of evil. Like, if God is benevolent and all good, why did bad things happen? Why are there evil actions? And this kind of philosophical inquiry around that. I think in a lot of spiritual communities, and especially a lot of New Age communities, there isn't really a solid answer to the problem of evil. Is there evil in the world? And if so, how do we deal with it? Because everything is, this person is wounded, this is their process. And also there's a real, I think, reticence to put boundaries in place. And so people with narcissistic tendencies, I think, almost gravitate towards those communities, because that lack of boundaries allows for greater status, greater power, greater manipulation. And then very often what happens is that people realize, oh shit, we need to put boundaries in place, but then everyone feels uncomfortable about doing it. And so there's something around... There's the bigger philosophical question of, is there such a thing as evil, or is everyone just wounded? Which is kind of the trauma response. Trauma is sort of psychology's answer to the problem of evil, in my view. It's like, no, bad things happen because of trauma, or it has become that in certain aspects of it. So that lack of dealing with narcissism, a part of it is setting very firm, very clear, very unmoving boundaries, and that when that's not in place, it's a bit of a catastrophe.
Yeah.
And just to add onto that, so boundaries, yes, and also I think there's something about lineage, and you asked earlier the question on community. I think something with spiritual narcissism, maybe it's a segue that we're going to talk about gurus and like what happens with leaders where it turns a bit to the dark side, is that when you use these substances that amplify consciousness or spiritual practices, it gives you a lot more power, like you get access to a lot more. And I believe that we all have the dark side, and as I certainly have the dark side, and I can catch myself sometimes in moments where I can use the added presence, the added awareness of people's psyches to, manipulate my boyfriend to get what I want. Like it's real. It's real for me. It's really like Star Wars. It's like the Jedis, and there's the dark side, and it's like it can pull all of us, and then what is it that keeps us aligned? Like the spiritual narcissist, the possibility for it is in all of us. The abusive guru, it's in all of us. And then what is the practice? What is the greater vision? What is the community to help remind us, okay, like what are we really here for? What are the reflections that we get?
I mean, it's not helped by the... Sorry, you go, David, please.
No, I mean, just on that, I love that point about manipulating your boyfriend having taken lots of psychedelics, because, you know, traditionally speaking, like ayahuasca wouldn't be used in very much ways that we do here in the West. You know, it's used for hunting magic, sorcery, and love magic primarily. That would have been the major uses of ayahuasca. It's not all kind of angels and light and all the rest of it. You know, it's very pragmatic for everyday kind of stuff, like where do I get food, how do I get someone to love me, and how do I get revenge on that particular person, or remove the effects of somebody's evil eye on me, you know. So it's like we've recontextualized the use of ayahuasca in a very different way. So it's not actually that bad a thing that you use psychedelics to manipulate your boyfriend. I think it's very brave of you to admit that.
Any other confessions? But it's interesting, we have these sort of dual narratives of one, everybody supposing to need to get more power, you know, stand in your power. But at the same time, on the flip side, we're broken, you know, we're traumatized. So, you know, it's quite a toxic cocktail, isn't it?
Yeah, and ultimately, it seems like power can, in itself, is corrupting, you know. Obviously, we know that, but we see it from every major guru from every discipline the world over. At some point, they have feet of clay, and there's some terrible scandal comes out about them. Every one of them, even Mother Teresa, right? You know, it's like there isn't one you can think of that hasn't, in some way, had some kind of scandalous stories attached to them. And I don't know what the answer to that is, other than that seems to be part of human nature in a way.
It comes back to the model, doesn't it? It's all a pattern. Does anyone else want to talk to that idea of it being an inevitability that absolute power corrupts? Absolutely. Mark, you've got to have something good to say about that, haven't you? Sorry to put you on the spot, but I know you've got it.
Well, I'm thinking partly about the erotics of all this as well, and it's one of the problems of framing things. You know, we've talked about when things are framed through lens of trauma, but another framing that clearly helps in one instance, that of talking about victims and perpetrators, can in the second instance lead to a kind of blindness. And I think particularly when it comes to sexual abuse, this is kind of where we're at. We're realizing that the victim-perpetrator way of discussing sexual abuse helps us to get to sort of first base, but we need to think more about the links between erotics and spirituality, particularly in terms of the conversation today. Because if you look back through ancient wisdom traditions, you know, eros is the love, the desire, the yearning for that which is beautiful and for the divine. You know, Dante wrote a masterpiece, The Divine Comedy, which is largely about exploring all this. And so I think that we need to, much like, you know, not just resorting to talking about things in terms of trauma, but also in terms of victims and perpetrators, and which of course is to say that's not appropriate at some point. This is the tricky thing. We need to be wise about it, but to be able to move on or through, perhaps would be a better way of putting it, that kind of discourse as well.
But I think also both parties, both the practitioner and the client, have a responsibility to play in that. And I wanted to ask the retreat, the space holders, what is it like to be on the other side when, I think, Jennifer, you mentioned to me that sometimes your clients think of you as angels, you know, and you're like, we're just facilitators. But what do you experience when when one of your clients has had a really powerful transformation and they want to sort of pin that on you? Does that happen? How do you deal with it?
Yeah, sure. I guess it's the same thing, to just keep our own ego in check, keep our own material in check, and just having that ongoing attunement to our own experience, and just knowing that whether somebody thinks, you know, even just right now sitting on this panel, there might be people in the crowd who think of us as experts, some people who think of us as arrogant, whatever, and actually it doesn't make me any better or any worse, whatever the projection is. And it's exactly the same, you know, because I hold space on psychedelic retreats and people have experiences of touching their own divinity, their own immensity, their own beauty, and they decide to kind of project that onto me because I happen to be in the space when they had that experience. It just doesn't change who I am, and I think there's just that absolutely essential quality that all facilitators should keep developing is just be stable, you know, just not to take on the projections and just gently hold it, let it be what it is, let it be therapeutic for the person without thinking that it's making you any better or worse.
It's a great advert for Buddhism. Thank you. Ali, what's your experience?
Yeah, I think similarly, being very aware of transference and projection, and then also to something Stefana said earlier, I think having a shadow work practice of inquiring into your own shadow. And, you know, I very recently had a participant say, "Oh, I looked up in the ceremony, you look like an angel." But I was like, I suppose I was wearing all white probably. And obviously you're in a position of looking after people in authority. And actually what I thought internally, I was like, oh my God, if you actually knew me. Like that. And so it can be like you can... because also people are in an altered state. If you're paying attention, it's like that is very much part of their experience, right? And it's actually nothing to do with you, aside from the role that you're in, because they don't really know me. They don't, you know, I'm playing a particular role. I'm not self-disclosing a lot of my own experience, and I need to play that role in order to create a safe container. But there's this difference between the role and you as a human being, which I think needs to be really clearly demarcated in yourself, and then also having supervision is very important because it helps you to see what is yours and what is coming from a participant or participants, plural.
Yeah, and I think this point on you step into a role and you become an archetype and you give yourself for that person, for the whole room. But I think something for me personally that's also interesting is when we get these angel projections and, oh, we're so awesome, not to be like, oh, no, that's it's like, yes, that is a part of who I am, and that's what I'm stepping into. And I'm also a bitch. I'm just not showing that to you right now. It's like I'm offering you the highest version of myself, but then also not just within us, in the team and within myself, but also actually within the retreat container still, to bring it back to also that realness, so that it can serve the process of the participants. So it's like, yes, and we're all humans, and so we really try to balance the two always.
Thank you. If I can just add something quickly, I guess it's kind of with me that question about Buddhism. What can Buddhism contribute to this conversation or to this kind of situation? And there's something actually in everything that we've been talking about, whether it's spiritual emergencies or psychosis, spiritual narcissism versus not having spiritual narcissism. The truth is that I think we're all sort of, to different degrees and in different ways, quite intoxicated on our own experiences, whether it's our narratives, our biases, our sense of self. And there's something about Buddhism and about meditation that's trying to get to the bottom of what consciousness is, what we are, beyond all the biases. It's kind of trying to, it's actually sobering up from this constant grasping at everything that arises in our experience.
So tempting, isn't it? Jules, I wanted to ask you, what's come up in your research around this topic?
Well, I did an article called Psychedelic Workers of the World Unite, where I interviewed various guides about the challenges they've faced. And one of the big ones was transference and countertransference. People during ceremonies taking their clothes off, you know, falling in love with a person, hitting on the guides, all this stuff. So I think anyone who goes to a psychedelic retreat or to psychedelic therapy should have some awareness of the dynamics of transference and countertransference, that you might very well feel love for your guide and it's just a temporary thing and it passes. So that will be one thing. The other thing I thought about in terms of looking to spiritual leaders and thinking they're God and forgetting that they're feet of clay. I think there's a balancing act there between not thinking that any particular spiritual leader is God, but then the other side is the other risk is never following anyone because you're so afraid of kind of cult dynamics and you're such an individualist and such a skeptic that you never follow any path, you never really give yourself to any path. So that's the kind of razor edge between the two, like over-devotion and over-skepticism.
Yeah, I mean, this conversation it totally brings us into, the problem of cults and the sort of suppression of critical thinking, and it's just such a unique and specific set of circumstances that all lead to the path of cult and guru. As you were saying, of course they'll end up as abusive, you abusing their power, and it's sort of inevitability, isn't it?
I guess if you accumulate too much power, yeah. I mean, I guess like there might be lots of spiritual practitioners and teachers out there who don't have kind of vast followings or don't necessarily want to have vast followings. I don't necessarily know. I mean, yeah, it's possible, right? But that is a route that is open to people who become very successful spiritual leaders.
But it's not just the one individual, it's a whole
there's
community,
a whole community around
elevating that person. That's this crazy but kind of almost fabulous story that arises. That's
and there's
happens
almost
over and
invariably
over
some
again.
kind of spiritual hierarchy that kind of develops around them as well.
Yeah. Hallie, did you want to?
I think it's interesting to think about systems in this regard, because when we construct governmental systems, for example, I think the U.S. Constitution is quite a good example of. It's not perfect, but for something of that time, it's pretty robust, where there's a recognition, and of course they were in the context of an oppressive power structure, so there's a recognition that if power is too concentrated in one area, things usually go wrong. So you have these three branches, and they sort of all keep each other in check, ideally. It doesn't quite work like that. But, I have a friend, Doshin Roshi, who runs a Zen school. He's a Zen master, and he does a lot of shadow work, and he implemented something in the school where the students of the school can, a certain percentage of them, if they think he is not looking at his own shadow, they can kind of get together, make that statement, and he has to go to psychotherapy for a certain amount of time. And then he comes back, and then there's another meeting, how do they feel about that? And eventually there's a whole process in place whereby he can be kicked off. He's no longer the head of the school. He's out, And so that's a very interesting, whether, I don't know how well it works in theory, but in practice, but in theory, having some kind of system of checks and balances in place in advance, and this is again a part of the shadow work of every individual recognizing we all have the capacity to abuse power. It's part of being human. And so we just mitigate that capacity already by recognizing that and then building systems. So often systems get forgotten in this, but that's, looking at how things interconnect with each other and looking in terms of power can be very helpful, I think.
Jules, in your psychedelics research, did the idea of groupthink or lack of critical thinking come up at all?
I mean, I think in all that, I think one of the issues is that we're kind of babes in the wood when it comes to ecstatic experiences. For centuries, we marginalized and pathologized ecstatic experiences. They've exploded back into our culture since the 60s, even more today. And none of us get taught how to relate to ecstatic experiences, how to make sense of them. So we can just jump to too literal interpretations of them. We've had people who, Mama Ayahuasca told them to invest all their money in crypto. Mama Ayahuasca told them to build a kind of pyramid on the Amazon. I mean, maybe that was a metaphor or something like that. So there are different ways to relate to revelations. But I was thinking about cults. How big of a problem is a cult today in modern spiritual culture? Was this more of a thing in the 70s? So as a quick straw poll, put up your hand if you would, if you have had direct experience of a cult or a friend or loved one has ended up enmeshed in a cult. So it's still fairly common then today. Yeah.
And as I understand it, it can be quite nuanced as well. It can be, a cult of one, or, where it's again, it feels like an inevitability. Would you talk to that, David? This. You don't have a choice.
I mean, I don't really know. I think it's a matter of how big. I mean, all right, you can have small cults, I suppose. I mean, effectively everything's a cult, isn't it? Culture is a kind of cult. Any kind of group of people becomes its own kind of cult. So
But I guess it's where people start to just accepting, and where there's abuse. There are sort of very specific
Yeah, and it's dangerous when people are in very vulnerable open spaces, which like psychedelics can often do. Like the danger is that you are open to manipulation or become hypersuggestible or have this kind of insider mentality, etc., etc. You know, it's very ripe for manipulation and very quickly going down a slippery slope into kind of cult behaviour. But that's the same with every spiritual path. I don't think there's anything specific to psychedelics other than the volumes probably turned upon the degree of suggestibility that you're open to, you know. But it's not purely a psychedelic thing, and everyone's going, oh, psychedelics are dangerous and they're going to cause cults and spiritual gurus and narcissism. But this is an issue across the whole spiritual spectrum, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
In psychotherapy, you have supervision, of course, and but it means something quite particular, and often that it's when you've made a mistake or when you feel you are falling in love with your client, or when you don't know what to do, you feel stuck. And often a good supervision group will be the one that can with whom you can bring up those most difficult and negative experiences, because they can be treated, first of all, with trust. You trust the confidentiality of the group, but they're going to be clues. There's something in that which is worth exploring, and that ultimately, you hope you'll be able to pass back to the patient. So not being afraid of the negative, maybe even wanting to talk more about what's difficult, negative, embarrassing, and so on, is a useful practice as a sort of personal check, but actually, maybe the most valuable material as well.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to go back a little bit to the role of the client, the customer, in creating cults. And you talked earlier about a spiritual health crisis, and the sort of desperation. I wonder what advice can you share with everybody about stepping back and holding on to yourself and trying to not be so suggestible?
I think that one of the key muscles that is underdeveloped in our day and age is intuition, is our gut feeling. We get so distracted by everything, technology, social media, and we also get so numbed out, so we don't feel our intuition. But we all have it. We all know. We can sniff. Our nervous systems are all trained to be wired with each other, to sense for danger, to sense when something's off. So that, like, for me personally, I can say it's like I can feel right away with some teacher or some people where I'm just like, I just know I wouldn't feel safe to go into that kind of space, or just somebody else as a friend was like, ooh, I don't trust them quite, and then we can get into a lot of mind. I feel like I've sworn a lot, so mind fucking. Around, okay, is it me? Is this my project? Is it my own material? Which is healthy, but it also cuts us off from trusting our intuition. So I think the main thing would be trusting my gut feeling and erring on the side of, like, if I feel something is off, then following that, like erring on the side of caution. And the other thing is trusting your friends, trusting recommendations. And that's hard because there are a lot of people, I mean, the people that come to our retreats, a lot of them don't know anybody who is, like, they wouldn't know about Medicine Festival. So it's hard because then they go by the internet, etc. But unfortunately, that is a very difficult route to go, because as we spoke about earlier, there are plenty of retreat centers that have 5-star reviews, because also, fortunately, barring certain conditions or circumstances, it's not that hard to give someone a good psychedelic experience. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of really not so great centers who do that. So yeah, I'd say like trying to find people that you can trust, trusting your own intuition, off the top of my head.
Ali, do you have anything to add to that, and how we can avoid falling for the wrong?
Not so much. I mean, I think I was just thinking, some of it is temperamental, and I think you alluded to this. It takes two to tango. So we often think of a cult power dynamic as there's the charismatic person or people manipulating the people coming. But, you know, when you research cults, it's like, yes, that is true. But the other side of it is people are getting their needs met, particularly belonging needs, by joining into it. And in some way, it becomes more reciprocal than it seems, because they're asking something of the leader or leaders and receiving it. And then so there's a real tangle. I think, yeah, to Stefana's point, intuition and discernment, which goes back to that point about the kind of conspiracy theories that are really rampant and the bad sense making in a lot of these communities. There's a real sense of discernment needed, and that's a skill. That's a cognitive skill that needs to be developed alongside any kind of spiritual state skills. It's the same thing when you go online and try and figure out something about the pandemic or this or that or what's going on in Ukraine. It's like you have to use enormous amount of discernment and be comfortable again with uncertainty.
Thank you. Jules, I was wondering about what you've spotted in terms of, you know, do people talk about cults in your body of research? You know, do they feel like they were caught up in something?
I've done like reporting on cults. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how, you know, whether they're still a big thing. I think one thing I've noticed is, in the last few years, is online cults. We used to have this idea of cults. You know, you go to the jungle and you live in, you know, Jonestown or whatever and gather around the leader. And now, during the pandemic, people were getting radicalized by online influencers, and you know, so you don't even have to, you know, be in the same room as a very charismatic individual. You can just be watching YouTube videos of them, and the kind of repetition and indoctrination actually happens through the YouTube algorithm, because you watch one, you know, video of whoever, and it'll suggest more and more and more, and influencers are quite good at cultivating parasociality. You know, they'll do eye staring, hypnotic music, just, you know, speaking with total certainty. So, you know, spirituality is constantly creative and innovative. And in the last 10 years, you got like online gurus, and they've become massive. And then they say, if you really want to become a kind of, you know, top platinum stage follower, then come to my retreat in Costa Rica and so on. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's the whole industry around it. It's terrifying. Mark, I wanted to ask you about this idea of the spiritual health crisis. And where do you think the balance lies? Do you think we're more aware than ever of our trauma, or do you think we're a broken society?
Well, maybe...
I don't mean societally broken, I mean, do we think we're all broken?
Sure, in some way. I think, you know, we're here... Well, a lot of the great wisdom traditions, Buddhism, Christianity, certainly, you know, suffering is really the first thing that's said, or is the central image and symbol. So that must be part of what it is to be human. I think that, you know, it's partly also, and this is echoing what has been said a little, but there's a theory of secularization which has become quite prominent most recently in philosophy circles associated with the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor. And he talks about secularization not as the disappearance of God, but rather as a kind of, he talks about a supernova of a sort of a myriad experiments with the spiritual. And that includes atheistic spirituality, or even forgetting that side of oneself. And I guess that we're right in the middle of that, and that the psychedelic interest now is even more so perhaps in the 60s, is playing into that space. And so, you know, chaos and the difficulty of discernment are going to be part and parcel of it. And maybe just recognizing that is in itself quite helpful.
Thank you. Did anyone else on the panel have anything to say about... Yes, hello.
I just want to add to the muscle of intuition. I'd say another really important one is patience. We're incredibly impatient, and people are suffering, and so there can be this like, I must get this now, and actually the psyche, the soul, whatever you believe in, but it's like there's a time for healing. And in my personal experience, there have always been moments where it's like, okay, now is the time to go to this, or like waiting, like, okay, this is and that being in that space of, okay, I can feel drawn to this, but I don't quite know yet with whom or when or how, and just tolerating that waiting until it's like, okay, now I know, now is the sign, and that's something we're very, very unskilled at, and that is very important.
It's kind of the opposite of spiritual bypassing.
Yeah, just to add to something that came up from what Jules and Mark were saying, I think it's really important to look at the internet and how that intersects with new religious expressions. There's a great book called Strange Rites by Tara Isabella Burton, and she makes this really great point that you can look at particular religions linked to technology and the spread of them. So you can look at the spread of Protestantism alongside the spread of the printing press, because there was this democratization of every, and it was really based on literacy. You needed to be able to have your own personal relationship with God and read the Bible, and so it really spread with the printing press. She makes the point that our current religious forms are the kind of DIY religions. Like, I'm going to take a bit of Buddhism, I'm going to take a bit of that, I'm going to take a bit of this. Oh, I like that. And so that's an internet thing. The internet is multiple identities, multiple perspectives. It's democratized everything. You can have a bit of everything. And there's a very open question as whether that's any good for us. Because, of course, it's very individualistic. And there's something which is a bigger cultural problem to the lack of spiritual health, is that if there is nothing beyond you, and there's nothing beyond our culture, and there's no higher order purpose, then what you get is either nihilism or narcissism, and usually a ping-ponging between the two. And so having that third thing is actually very, very important, whatever it is.
Thank you.
I
David?
find that, no, just interested in what you're saying there, Ali. I was wondering, that's fascinating, whether there's different spiritual strains you're getting with different kind of technologies and social media platforms. Now, you're a TikTok expert. What's the kind of particular spiritual strain you're seeing emerging from TikTok, for instance?
Oh God, reluctant TikToker as of about a month. I think TikTok is got this kind of frenetic, to Stefana's point, quick fix everything. More. Like, give us the main message I've had on TikTok is we want more, and it's like, my God, it's like voracious, right? So, and that's an internet thing, and that's particularly that platform is based on this kind of snacking of content, and maybe there'll be a counterpoint of, people going offline and switching off and wanting a much more deep, rich, slower experience. There's always a back and forth and a flip-flopping, I think.
Thanks.
Thank you. Did you want to say something?
It's just something that's coming to mind. It's actually therapy. I think we don't talk about psychotherapy enough, perhaps, and we want healing work to be glamorous or romantic. We want the high, we want the peak experiences, but I think it's absolutely indispensable to balance any kind of high intensity work with really down-to-earth, grounding, unglamorous practices like meditation, just sitting and watching your own mind with nothing at all, or doing psychotherapy, and especially when we're talking about kind of intuition, and there is something where our nervous system sometimes have kind of miswired in childhood because of traumatic experiences or challenging experiences, and so we do get drawn to the wrong things. We can get stuck in abusive relationships, and there's something about psychotherapy that can really help people cultivate that sharpness and clarity and discernment in their own mind. And it's a tricky one, because it's easy to say everybody should get therapy, but it is an expensive service. But yeah, I would recommend it highly to anybody on a spiritual path.
And do you think it should just be an ongoing thing? You have a therapist.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it also doesn't have to be that everybody's in therapy for their entire life, but I don't think we need to be in a particularly strong crisis to benefit from psychotherapy. I think it's a very valuable practice.
Thank you. We've got a bit of time for questions from the audience. Did anyone want to ask any of this amazing panel? Yeah, please.
Yeah, so I noted 2 questions down. I'll just say them both, and whoever feels they can answer should. So when we were talking initially about post-trip difficulties, you described DPDR essentially. Are we talking specifically about clinical conditions like that, or just painful integration process as well? That was question 1.
It's depersonalization and derealization. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Could you repeat that acronym?
Yeah, the question is, when I was talking about post-trip difficulties, in our survey, 15% of people reported derealization and depersonalization. So I had this after an ayahuasca retreat where for about a week afterwards, I was so derealized. I wasn't sure what reality I was in, whether I was in a dream or in the afterlife or stuff like that. I thought that was an extremely weird experience, so I was reassured to find that 15% of our survey had a similar kind of experience. Depersonalization is a bit similar. It's when you feel yourself is fragmented or you feel untethered from yourself. Whether it's clinical, often it's not diagnosed, but people might know about it. This is quite serious stuff. Yeah, people can feel like a deep sense of unreality. But in our survey, for a lot of the time, it passed. Because I interviewed the person who runs the UCL's derealization unit. He's the world specialist. For him, a lot of people after they smoke, they get derealization from smoking cannabis, yes. And it stays for a long time. And they come to his unit and he says, well, we can give you CBT to help you accept it. But in our survey, for quite a few people, thankfully, it does pass after weeks or months.
Thank you. And the second mostly goes to people holding retreats about the screening process. Well, I understand that you want to minimize harm and people with psychosis and bipolar are not the best candidates. A, could it be that we could be excluding some people that really could benefit from those modalities? And B, how do you know? Like if somebody is bipolar but has not ever been diagnosed, can you assess it just from an interview online? Thank you.
Thank you. Great question.
Thanks for that question. And actually, there's so much to say about the screening process. I mean, the main, couple of points, and then Steph can, of course, add to that. First, we have quite a thorough process. So there's a really long application form, but it's not just based on the form. Like we have a one-on-one call with the person. So if things haven't been disclosed or things haven't been diagnosed, there's a skilled, trained human on the other side that's kind of scanning for red flags in the conversation. And of course, there's the kind of obvious criteria, like if there's a history of psychosis in the family, if the person has bipolar disorder. But there's also other things that are more subtle, like is it the right time for a person? Because there might be sort of fit enough for a psychedelic experience, but perhaps they need to engage with a bit of psychotherapy before, or they need to kind of, just do a bit more work before they're ready to be in a group experience, which is also like a particular kind of context. To the other question, it's a really tricky process for us, and we have a lot of conversations in the kind of screening team, because sometimes I think we probably do say no to people who might benefit from it, but the thing is, like, we can't run the risk of ruining their life because maybe they'll benefit. So generally we have like a very kind of cautious approach. Sometimes it can also be that psychedelics could probably help the person, but a clinical setting would be more appropriate than a kind of group retreat. These are some kind of thoughts.
Just to follow on, and also in the group setting, our duty of care is to the participant, to the one person, but also to the group. So it might be like Jen said that they might benefit, but the clinical setting might be more appropriate for the more one-on-one setting because they need so much care, but also because if you're in a group setting and you have a limited number of people available, then it will suck all the attention of the facilitators and impact the group field. And also, we are still in a gray zone time, and it is super heartbreaking. Like, sometimes you have to turn people away, and it's so heartbreaking that that's what we have to do. But we have to also keep the larger picture in mind of where we're at in the psychedelic renaissance, that our duty of care is also to the individual participant, to the group of participants, and then to the whole psychedelic field, because it could so easily still mess up. So, there's a lot of factors at play.
David.
Yeah, just on that point, and one thing that was perhaps surprising from the survey, if I've got this right, Jules, is that there didn't seem to be any relationship to having a prior mental health diagnosis to having a long-term challenging experience. So it's like there's not a sense necessarily where we can predict who's going to have a negative experience, like long-term problematic experience necessarily, even if you do have a prior mental health condition. So.
There was one in this Canadian psychedelic survey. One of the predictors of having an intensely bad experience was having had an intensely good experience. So either it's just because you're having lots of experiences and eventually you're going to roll a 6 or a 1, or there are certain people who just have intense experiences.
Yeah, and just one more. I also want to say yes, we can't always tell if someone has been diagnosed, and also what's becoming an increasing problem is that people will lie. like we've definitely had increasing numbers of people lying about being on antidepressants or having and sometimes people don't remember their trauma, but like that speaks to that point of desperation and knowing, you know, we have all these disclaimers of we can't take you if X, Y, Z, da 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 da, so they know that we won't take them if they have this, and then they'll avoid it. And luckily we have amazingly skilled facilitators that when, you know, push comes to shove, we have been able to hold everything, but it's a very tricky point in time that we find ourselves in when people aren't honest anymore, and when you get it.
Or as you said, they don't remember. Like
yeah, exactly. Or they.
Impossible to prepare.
Yeah.
That was such a great question. So fruitful. Any other questions?
Yeah.
No pressure.
Yeah.
Yes, go.
There's potentially a follow-up question about the link between neurodiversity and psychedelics. You obviously talked about bipolar and mental illnesses and those conditions, but what about someone with ADHD or autism where the brain is wired slightly differently? Is there much research in that field at all?
Researchers, looking to you guys.
There is some emerging research. There's not a huge amount, like mostly kind of survey work at this point. And there seems to be a tendency that the majority of people with autism and with ADHD do seem to respond quite favourably to psychedelics. They report, you know, a not necessarily lessening of the symptoms, or if you can call them symptoms, that people just have better insight and better able to manage their condition on the whole. So there's a general kind of positive outcome. It could be sampling biases or whatever, but increasingly there's lots of people with autism or ADHD who've taken psychedelics and tend to report quite favourably on their experiences.
Maybe just to add another sort of complicating twist is that I think it's worth being alert to this kind of medical language. You know, people have this, the brain's wired that way. There's no mental health condition outside of a couple where there's actually a clearly determined physiological cause to the condition. Depression, it's all sorts of things. They're always kind of clusters of symptoms that at different times and different places get grouped together and put under a label. And so you get words like neurodiversity coming up, which is essentially saying, I don't want to be put into any particular box. And that's sort of valuable in its own way. There's not even a default mode network in the brain. It's just a model, a map that tries to make some sense of the terrain. So always be aware, I think, of the limitations of the language as well. And again, you know, in one moment that feels uncertain, but in another moment it's quite helpful.
Yeah, and just to add to that, there's also to Mark's point, there's a whole question in the psychedelic field, the clinical field of the fact that psychedelics tend to be transdiagnostic. So someone goes into a clinical trial with depression, but there's a huge complexity that's revealed about what's actually going on, because every person is a whole universe in and of themselves. And so in a way, and David Arizzo, who might be at Medicine, who heads up the Imperial Psychedelic Research Group, he's talked about this quite a lot, about how it and my wife Ashley Murphy Beiner also talked about this, like it kind of, psychedelics offer a new paradigm in that they get us out a little bit of that strict diagnostic category just because of how they work. At the same time, to answer your question, there is research by Alicia Danforth on people with autism with MDMA specifically, and with some pretty positive results around, really touching as well. Some people are reporting it's the first time I really got empathy with another person. It allowed them to have that experience, which in many cases had lasting effects on their ability to relate. So so there is a little bit going on there as well.
That's fascinating. I know there was a question over here. Yeah, can we get a microphone over here? Okay, sure, go for it, please.
Thank you so much for that panel. I really like the phrase toxic cocktail that you used to talk about the idea of kind of this grey space where there's the illegality of many of these ceremonies in this underground world. And then obviously in that there's also things like covert sexual abuse, narcissism, like all of those behaviours. So I'm wondering, how do we kind of unmix the cocktail and disentangle the things that we do want to be happening, like the underground healing, the people who are doing the work really well, from the kind of covert, clandestine, negative things that kind of piggyback on the clandestineness and inhabit that space?
So hard to unpick, isn't it? Does anyone have a one-liner for that? It's so hard, isn't it? I mean, I guess it's...
what we can talk about things like bring it out from the underground, like bring it overground. Like that gives bad actors, that bad actors like the shadows. They like not being held accountable. So bring it overground, make it legal, make it somewhat regulated. When people behave badly, write about it. If necessary, take them to court. That kind of thing.
I think it's helpful to have some trusted experts in your life. I mean, Jules is one of my trusted experts on ecstatic integration. But I don't know, there's a professor of anthropology called Beth Singler, and she's really good, I think, at this whole area of new religious movements and discerning what's going on with them. So get a little cluster of experts that you trust, and a process of self-education, I suppose.
Let's get this gentleman over here who's been waiting patiently.
Thank you so much. The panel was fascinating. I wanted to say, tomorrow in the Cacao tent, we've got a conversation happening about models of regulation post-market authorization. So when products reach market, how is that going to look? And I wanted to ask the panel if you would join us, first of all, tomorrow at 10 a.m. for that discussion, but also, how do you think we protect the public from all the issues that you've brought up today when more access is available?
I mean, you were talking about this, Mark, about how to be safe, it really has to remain a niche activity. You can't have 100,000 people doing it, because people will, just for the numbers, will have psychosis.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a skeptic when it comes to how far this is going to go. I mean, I guess there'll be decriminalisation. Whether there's actual prescribing in an enormous organisation like the NHS, I doubt, because it's one way in which spiritual capitalism will kick back, because before you know what's happened, there'll be class actions, and big organisations, companies will stand to lose a lot of money. So my guess is there's going to be some sort of middle ground, maybe some extent of decriminalisation, but perhaps I'm speaking as a psychotherapist here, which always has a bit of an ambivalent relationship to the mental health profession as a whole. If you work in a psychiatric hospital, you'll know there's some consultants that are quite psychologically minded and they kind of like psychotherapy, but there are others there that just think it's completely bogus and a load of woo. And I suspect that there'll be something similar. It'll be not exactly marginal, but it'll have some sort of difficult ongoing relationship, psychedelics, I think, to the wider world.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to add to that point as well, Timmy's point. I was in Denver for the psychedelic science, big psychedelics conference, and I met with one of the people responsible for. So Denver has decriminalized plant medicines and some psychedelic molecules, and that only happened in November, and now they're faced with, well, what do we do now? This has happened a few times. It's also just happened in Australia in a different way clinically, where suddenly the quick legalization or quick decriminalization, and then the opposite problem of, how do we do this responsibly? So I think education is absolutely crucial. Good educational resources, and giving people the agency to be able to seek out their own educational resources, but that has to be there and be provided. It was in the underground with like Erowid and websites that had a lot of information about drugs before it was cool, basically 10, 15 years ago and longer. But what they're doing in Colorado is they're going into schools, and if anyone remembers like the DARE thing, the kind of drug awareness thing where people would go into schools in the Reagan era and beyond and talk about why you shouldn't do drugs. They're not quite saying why you should do drugs, but what they're saying is how might you approach psychedelics, for example, responsibly and with care. What are the key things you need to know? How do you need to prepare? How do you need to integrate? And they'll be doing that to high school students. So it'll be interesting to see how that actually pans out and what the reception is. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah.
Thank you for being here and for sharing very stimulating insights and perspectives. I was wondering, I guess it's two questions, one short one. How long do you stay in touch with participants after your retreats to do the integration work? And then, I guess, to whoever feels called to answer it, how do you think can classical psychotherapy offer space to discuss with their clients spiritual and philosophical questions, where an individual might struggle to make sense of their own perception of the world, but seeks answers that don't really fit into 3D reality? Most psychotherapy seems as more in a clinical space and more analytical rather than energetic or 3D, beyond the 3D world.
Jennifer, do you want to, that feels like something, would you answer that? I mean, certainly the first part you can do on how long you integrate.
Sure. So at the moment, we offer a kind of month-long integration journey. So there's calls 1 week, 2 week, 3 week after the retreat itself. We actually used to offer and had designed like a whole 9 months long integration journey, but we ended up shortening it because what we found is that the level of commitment from participants varied so much in the groups. So the groups were kind of crumbling because it's on Zoom, it's online, so it doesn't fit everyone. So what we do now is like a shorter, more condensed kind of integration journey straight after the retreat. And we also invite our participants to stay in touch with us as a team. A lot of us on the team offer one-on-one work, psychotherapy work, so they know that they can kind of reach out to their facilitators to arrange further one-on-one work if they wish to. And yeah, that question of sense making, I think, is really important. The other thing that we do, and that's part of the retreat, is that we have a whole conversation about integration where we share a lot of tips, ideas, suggestions on how to navigate the kind of aftermath of the experience. We send some links, some resources, some kind of pointers for other retreats, courses, activities, communities, because often actually the sense making is supported by just feeling part of a group, feeling part of a community. I can see there's some past participants sitting right here now who've started coming to medicine after the retreat. So we kind of point people in a lot of directions and we stay available as a team.
I'm going to quickly pass the mic to Jules just to add something.
A very quick point is I think there's so much focus at the moment on training psychedelic guides for the actual session. And I think we need much more focus on training therapists to help the minority of people who get into difficulties.
That's a great point.
There is like organisations like the Institute for Psychedelic Therapy in the UK who have a register of trained and experienced qualified therapists who are also very open to helping people integrate or deal with problematic or even good psychedelic experiences that have brought stuff up. So there is kind of a register of people out there, but yeah, we probably will need more.
Do we have time for more questions? Yeah, can we have another question?
So just a direct response about the question of neurodiversity. There is a group called the Autistic Psychedelic Community, which was at Breaking Convention, the UK Psychedelics Conference. And I wanted to really reflect back something that I found really fascinating, which was from the two people who run the retreats, when you said that something that people actually take away and benefit from in terms of the psychedelic experience is actually the authenticity and the connection in how they're relating to people, and the fact that, or the sense that all of their feelings are valid. And I really wanted to reflect that back, because that's sort of what I'm taking away and what I found so fascinating. And if something comes to mind, then feel free to share.
Thank you. One more question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the great panel. I'm curious if any of you have come across, or if you have a sense of how psychedelics, not in an indirect way, but in a more direct way, actually contribute to societal change or to societal challenges such as ecological challenges or so.
So the man to my right wrote a book on this very topic.
I don't know. I think this was the original kind of promise of the countercultural 60s and kind of 70s, was that psychedelics would change the world. And what I'm very interested in is sort of reviving that idea, but probably with a much more nuanced yes and. Of course there is the potential, but I think there's a few different ways. I mean, one of them is that as human beings, what we experience in one state can be then applied to a different state because of how our cognition is embodied and deeply embedded in and interconnected. So, for example, if you do Tai Chi, you might start to have a more balanced and flowing perspective around philosophical ideas or different concepts. In a similar way, psychedelics, I think, can be very good training for navigating the world we live in, which is highly complex, huge amount of information, contradictory, emotionally intense. And so if we can get good at navigating that state and practicing that, we can then intentionally apply those skills to, for example, navigating the internet, but also relationships, complex political ideas. So there's that element of it. I think there's also a potential element, which is that there's research suggesting that psychedelics can move people to a more sort of panpsychist perspective in which the universe is seen as alive and conscious and full of meaning, rather than what we've received from the Enlightenment, which is that it's a dead, pointless, like a machine-like space. And of course, if that is our story of the world, then it makes absolute sense why we would destroy the environment and focus on consuming everything. And just because why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't we live like that if there really is no deeper meaning? So the potential of psychedelics to open people up to a perspective which is less egocentric and more world-centric, if that can be applied well, that's very powerful. And even when I spoke to Michael Pollan for my book about this, he's quite sort of scientific materialist, but he was saying, we were talking about a Johns Hopkins research around how people attribute, life to the world after psychedelics, and he was saying that, even if it's not true, it's beneficial. Even if we pretended to be animists, that would be better in terms of our relationship to the environment and one another. So there's much more I could talk about, but I think those are two of the areas where they can really help. And then, of course, then is the hard work of actually enacting new policies and changes, and that, again, requires deep relational coordination, which is something psychedelics can also open up. But it all depends on how we use them, not that we use them. That's the key thing. Yeah.
I'm going to give you a quick moment, Stefana, and then we'll wrap it up.
Quick moment on this huge topic. So I think there are a couple of things. While they are non-specific amplifiers, nonetheless, you can see like there are certain commonalities in psychedelic culture, and many people take psychedelics and feeling more connected to nature, feeling generally more interconnectedness, like having a connection that's beyond the small self. And I think all of these experiences that can be common in psychedelics point to ultimately a different way of life and a different way of being, and so I think there is that potential path that isn't an inevitable path, but it's kind of, there's a lot of potential in that direction. And the other aspect is the opening, the cracking open that happens, and the possibility to experience yourself momentarily, temporarily, for without your all your conditioning and all the stuff, and to experience what it's like to have an open heart, to be fully present. It gives you a taste of actually how magical, how one's life can be. Even that, just to have the wonderment of, oh my God, we live in paradise on earth. All of that, I think, are very potent ingredients for helping us get out of this quite sad situation we're in.
That is a great route out. Thank you for ending on that. Thank you so much, Medicine. You've been brilliant. Thank you to the panel. I just had one more thing to say, which is that 4 out of 6 of our panelists have books in the bookshop. Mark, you're going to point the direction of the bookshop. Where is it?
It's in the Resurgence tent, which is sort of down there, then slightly to the left.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And I don't think we shared the name of our organization. We're actually called Alalaho. So if you're curious about psilocybin retreats, feel free to check us out. We do weekly Q&As every Tuesday night. So if you have questions, don't hesitate to come and talk to us.
And if you want to learn how to pronounce the name, you can also come talk to us. Alalaho.
And thank you, Fleur, for facilitating.